Welcome to Aquatics by Nature. I featured this little tank in my Don't Top Up with Tap Water video last week, so I thought it made sense to give you a full sort of rundown and sort of general history of the tank this week. Anyway, this tank was actually set up in December 2007 and it's actually been in continuous operation ever since. And like all of my tanks, the substrate has never been cleaned, it's never been siphoned, it's never been hoovered. Basically, as you know, I try not to disturb it in any way. And I don't think this tank has actually ever had a water change in all those years, and I certainly don't remember doing one anyway, and if I have, it would have been an odd one, definitely. The tank itself it's only about 16 inches long, which is, I think, that's about 40 centimetres by around about 8 inches, 20 centimetres, and about the same tall, give or take a little bit. So it's something like 3 or 4 gallons, 15, 16 litres, something like that. And even way back in 2007, this was actually quite a beaten up kind of old glass tank that I sort of rescued from my shed. It was only ever set up as an experiment, and it's never been scaped or anything like that, nothing fancy. As I say, it was never intended to actually survive long term. It was really just an experimental tank. And in actual fact, what I may do later in the year is actually decant it into a new tank, because it doesn't look very nice at the moment. I'd like to keep it, but in a much more attractive kind of tank. So if I can find a decent looking nano, then I'll try and do that at some point, and needless to say, it's an excuse to make another video anyway. Anyway, the lighting on it is actually just a very simple replacement LED. It originally had a 15 watt fluorescent tube over it, but you can't get the tubes anymore, and it kind of died, so it's just got a very low powered LED strip on it. The tank is about as basic as you can get. It hasn't got a heater, it just sits at room temperature, which this time of the year is only around 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is about 18 Celsius. And it's actually never been heated in all the years that it's existed. As I say, it's a very simple, basic sort of tank. It's got no filter, it's got no circulation. I suppose basically it's a little bit like a tiny little indoor pond, really. As I say, it's never had a filter, it's never had any flow. It's literally just a little indoor pond. It's actually one of 2 tanks that I set up on the same day, and believe it or not, yes, I do actually have the other one, so I'm sure there'll be another video coming of that at some point. And for those of you who watch my other videos, you've heard me talk about Diana Walstad's book, The Ecology of the Planted Aquarium. Well, this book kind of blew my mind back in 2007, and although at this time I'd actually already been running tanks with no water changes for many years, I didn't have that great an understanding of how things worked and why things worked. So once I read that book, I really had to find out more, and hence I had a kind of a need for instant experimentation. I just didn't kind of expect those experiments to last 16 or 17 years, but that's sometimes how these things pan out, which is kind of good in a way, because it stood the test of time, and it's nice to see. Anyway, this tank was literally set up pretty much right after I read that book, cover to cover. And I think I'd probably describe this tank as a kind of a Walstad tank with a twist. It's kind of a dirty tank with a twist. And although I'd only just read the book, my brain was already kind of thinking, well, what if I did this? Or what if I did that? I have this terrible thing. I always sort of overthink things and always sort of thinking off on what other things I can do. So anyway, as I say, this was one of 2 tanks that I set up on that day. So I just chose this one to be the more experimental of the 2, shall we say. Anyway, this tank was actually set up with an inch of soil, but it actually didn't have any cap at all. So it's literally just soil. And I can kind of hear you screaming in the background, what? No cap? You can't do that? Well, I thought, well, why not? I was always looking at my ponds, and my ponds are basically soil with no cap, and they're often crystal clear, and some of my ponds are literally no bigger than a bucket. So I thought, well, why can't you just do exactly the same but indoors? The book had really kind of got me thinking, so I kind of thought, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? You know, it can't be a complete disaster. It might look terrible, but let's see how it goes. So anyway, I set it up, put the soil in, planted it quite heavily. It was a real kind of mix of plants in those days, but it did include the cryptocoryne that you see mostly in the tank at the moment. And to my kind of, well, I say amazement, but I was sort of quite confident even then, the growth was actually amazing for the first couple of weeks. I'd never seen anything like it. It was just fantastic. It was brilliant. Best thing I'd ever done. Incidentally, I absolutely love the look of an uncapped tank. It just, I don't know, it just kind of looks much more like a slice of nature. I know it's maybe not the most practical thing in the world, but I kind of like it anyway. Anyway, after a couple of weeks of planting it up and everything growing beautifully, well, what can I say? Things went kind of a little bit pear-shaped at this stage. I guess it wasn't that unexpected really, but the whole tank went absolutely pea green. I mean, when I say pea green, I mean pea green, a real pea super as we'd call it here. I mean, although the tank is only sort of 8 inches from front to back, you could not see the back of the tank. You know, if you put your hand in the tank, you couldn't see it. It was really quite unbelievable. And by this time, I'd had or been around aquariums long enough to know that really the best thing really was to not change anything and just sit it out. I've done this with ponds for, you know, many, many years, and you just sit it out and eventually they clear. Anyway, a few weeks went by, no change whatsoever. Absolute pea soup still. Really, the worst I've ever seen. I mean, worse than I've ever seen in a pond, and that's saying something, especially when it's in full sunlight. Anyway, underneath all of this, I had no real idea what the plants were doing because I just couldn't see them. It was really that thick. Anyway, I think I must have been out in the garden looking at my ponds, as I do, as I'm sure I've over-mentioned on this channel, but suddenly I kind of realised I had one of those little light bulb moments that you do. I was looking in one of my sort of, literally a bucket with a water lily growing in it, and the water was gin clear, and something just must have made me think, and I'd suddenly realised, of course, it's not just soil, water and plants in my buckets. There's loads of Daphnia, Cyclops and all kinds of other stuff, you know, wandering around, swimming around, whatever in the bucket. They're really alive. And I suddenly realised, of course, this is what my little tank was missing. So anyway, I swiftly netted out some of the Daphnia and added it to the tank. And I should say, incidentally, this was actually the catalyst for me starting to collect stuff to put in my tanks to make them more diverse. And you'll see later on that I've also added things like tubifex in this tank. But anyway, I put the Daphnia in the tank, and in no time at all, it absolutely exploded. I only put a very small amount in, and it just went crazy. And the water just was gin clear in no time. Really quite fantastic. But I always remember one of the most amazing things about this was that as the plants gradually emerged from the green pea soup, the plants themselves had actually done fantastically well, despite the pea green water, which must have been cutting the light out tremendously. There was also absolutely no algae on the plants, which was quite a surprise for any kind of new tank, to be honest. Anyway, now I've got this really quite pristine little tank. I was quite happy, quite pleased, so I thought, oh, time to put a little bit more life in it in terms of kind of aquarium life. So you've probably seen them. I put some of those, they call them little Japanese blue guppies. They're a bit like an endless guppy really, but blue. I put some of those in, and I put some of the wild type Neocaridina shrimps in there, which are actually still in the tank. And everything ticked along, went along beautifully. Anyway, if you sort of fast forward 16 or 17 years, which not really what I was expecting, the guppies had ticked along for many, many years. They must have been in the tank in excess of 10 years, but eventually they got very inbred and rather deformed, and they did die out. But those green shrimps are actually still going strong in this tank. There's not actually that many right now, and they tend to hide quite a lot, but once the weather gets a bit warmer, they'll start to breed again, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more to see in the tank. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling as I always do, but anyway, I should probably tell you what plants are actually currently in the tank. Well, the main plant that you can see that's covering across most of the tank basically, is Cryptocoryna affinis. For those who know or would like to know, this is actually probably one of the very first Cryptocoryna affinises. It's what they used to call Cryptocoryna hartleana, sort of way back in the 1960s. It doesn't look at its best at the moment because it's covered in all the mineral deposits from the kind of experiment I was doing to make last week's video, but you kind of get the gist. It's quite a nice looking Cryptocoryna anyway. There's also some other sort of common plants in there, like there's a little bit of guppy grass, the Nigas guadalupensis, and there's a little bit of Egeria nigas, and of course my good old favourite Ambulia, the bright green sort of feathery plant, the Limnophora sessiliflora. There's also a little bit of floating plant, although not very much at the moment. There's a little bit, I think, of water sprite, a bit of lettuce. And this tank has also had giant duckweed in it sort of perpetually, which is something else I collected from my ponds. And it sounds horrendous, doesn't it, giant duckweed, but it's actually rather ornamental. And they actually all, instead of being tiny like normal duckweed, it can be 6 or 7 millimetres across. It's actually quite ornamental and has red undersides, so it's actually quite a fun aquarium plant. There's also quite a few other critters in the tank. There's some bladder snails, which are my kind of workup crew, as it were. There's one nerite snail just to help keep the glass clean. And there's also quite a lot of Bithynia snails, which is actually another creature that I've collected from my ponds, which these are actually really fascinating creatures. And that reminds me, actually, I really must do a video on those. They're quite unique in some ways, but I'll come to that at another point. As I said, there's also quite a bit of tubifex in this tank, and as you can see, the tubifex absolutely loves mulm. It's one of those things, it lives in mud and mulm, and it's just does its waving thing. It just looks great. And the tubifex, I wish I'd have made a note of when I put it in, but it must have been in this tank more than 10 years now, and it's certainly a long while. And as you can see also from this, the mulm has somewhat built up over the years, and because the tank isn't filtered or circulated in any way, you tend to get much more build-up of mulm in these circumstances, because decomposition doesn't tend to be quite so complete, so you get a little bit more sort of waste, as it were. And when you think that this tank was actually set up with an inch of soil, there's actually now 2 inches of mulm actually on top of that soil, so there's actually a 3-inch total, which seems a bit crazy, but I kind of like it in a way, and as I say, I think it's kind of natural, so I don't really mind it. But I guess at some point I'll have to remove some, otherwise there won't be any water left. But when you consider it's taken sort of 16, 17 years to build 2 inches, that really isn't that much at the end of the day. And I do actually occasionally move a very small amount if I'm seeding new tanks, which is something actually I'll show you when I get around to doing the new tanks. But what I'll actually probably do is I'll wait until I get a new tank to decant it into, and then I'll sort of decide what I'm going to do, whether I'm going to tidy it up a little bit, as it were. But one of the things that really surprised me with the level of mulm in this tank was actually when I had the guppies in the tank, and guppies, as you know, kind of do their thing and breed like crazy, even in a little tank. And even with them in the tank, it actually stayed remarkably clear. You would have thought that having lots of guppies in a tank would have stirred it all up and there'd be mulm everywhere, the water would be cloudy, but actually it really was quite good. It was quite a surprise, really. And it's one of those little tanks that I've really enjoyed over the years, and I know it's not a thing of sort of beauty, as it were, it's just a little sort of ecosystem that I set up, but it's one of those little tanks that I've really learnt a lot of over the years, and I think kind of sort of gallon for gallon it's been really good fun. Anyway, I think one of the main takeaways, I suppose, is one of the things this tank really shows is just how long a Walstad dirty tank will actually go on for. When you think this tank has been running 16 or 17 years, it's never been fertilised. And as I said in one of my old videos, you really can have an aquarium for life. And I'll put a link in the description to anyone who wants to listen to my ramblings on that subject. But this tank has really stood the test of time. And I just love it. I know it's not pretty, but it's one of those things. I'll probably actually set up a separate playlist for this tank. So if anyone wants to follow what I sort of do with it in the future, they'll be able to do it quite easily. And as I say, I have a few plans for it later in the year. And I'll probably call it something along the lines of Old Green Shrimp Tank 2007. It's not very original, is it? But that'll kind of do, I guess. Anyway, if you'd like to know more about my naturally balanced, no water changed, unfertilised aquariums, I'd be eternally grateful if you'd subscribe and give me a like. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching.